40. And we're going to recite it together, alternating. So I've done it in blue and orange, and we're going to have a blue side and an orange side when we recite it. But I'm going to start by going through it. So when the time comes that we recite it together, going back and forth, we'll know what we're talking about. So I want to talk about, we say psalms all the time. It's right there in the book. What we fail to remember, I think, is that psalm is not supposed to be a technical word. It's the ordinary, everyday Hebrew word for a song. These songs that we sing at the beginning of worship, that's the kind of thing that the psalms are. These were written by worshipers at the temple. These were written by the priests and the Levites. At least 40 of the 150 psalms we have in our Bible were written by King David. Many of them confessions or praises to God for things that happened to him during his kingship. They were probably sung with some instrumental accompaniment. They probably weren't sung quite the way we do it. They probably would have sounded to you, if you heard them, more like they were being chanted, something like Gregorian chant, with a quiet instrumental accompaniment, and then some instrumental interludes. As a matter of fact, many of the psalms, if you look in a King James Bible, there'll be this word that appears and it says Selah. And the word is never translated because for 400 years nobody knew what it meant. Until we finally got a look at some other writings from back about that time, and we realized that what Selah meant was instrumental interlude here. And you'll find it scattered among the psalms. This psalm, the very first line in the psalm is not actually, I waited patiently for the Lord. The first line in the psalm, if you look in the Bible, is to the choir master, a song of David. All right, so it's instructions to the conductor. This psalm is one of the ones that David wrote, and David, you may remember, had a hard time of it for years. He was a shepherd boy, and then he worked for King Saul, and then King Saul became afraid of him and angry at him because Saul realized that God was probably going to give the kingdom to David, and David had to run for his life and hide from Saul, and then later, after Saul died, David had to hide out elsewhere for 6 or 7 years before finally he was acclaimed as the king of Israel. So David wrote several psalms that are a report that he had to wait and see what would happen and trust that God was in charge of what the outcome would be. And so he writes psalms that start like this: I waited patiently and God heard me. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. You got to remember that in those days people walked everywhere and there weren't very many roads. And mud and mire, swamps, slimy pits. I mean, Bruce Springsteen talks about the swamps of Jersey. If we hadn't built concrete and macadam roads all over New Jersey and you had to walk over this place, you'd pass through a swamp at least once a day. So this is not just poetic language. David's been out there marching around with the army, and time again the army marches into a cruddy place and has to get out of it, and it's a mess to walk through. So that's why he thinks of difficult situations in his life being like walking through the mud and then finding a place where you get to walk on dry ground and on solid rock. David loved to sing about what God had done for him. So he would say this: look, God gave me this song. He doesn't mean that he didn't write it. He doesn't mean that it appeared in his mind like a revelation that all he had to do was copy it out. He means God changed what happened in such a way that I was inspired to write this song, and the virtue of my writing this song is that other people hear it too. Is that other people hear it too. Because God isn't just on my side. God is on the side of all the people. So David says, blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord. And when he talks about the proud, when he talks about those who turn aside to false gods, what he means is those that trust in God do what God says. That's part of what trust means. It doesn't mean just this feeling of trust. Sometimes you might not have a feeling of trust when you're trusting God. But it means that you take a chance, you gamble on the basis that God will do what God has promised to do. And David remembers that God has done this before. God did lead the Israelites out of slavery. God did lead them through the desert. God did lead them into a land where they conquered the people who already lived there and took the farms and the fields and the cities for their own. If God has done this before, then we have every reason to hope that God will do something like that again. And when we need to support our trust for God, when we need to reinforce it, when we're afraid that God won't take care of us and don't feel very much like trusting God, one of the things we need to do is to recite the story of the things God has done for us. And reciting stories in the days before people could write everything down, they had writing in the time of David, but there might be no more than 500 or 600 books in the whole city of Jerusalem, and most of them in the king's palace or in the temple. Ordinary people didn't keep books in their house. So instead of writing things down in a book, you wrote them down in a song, because you can remember the words of a song. The rhythms and the melodies of a song help fix things in your memory. When I tell of your deeds, again, we're talking about what God has already done as an indicator of what God will do. Read next. And now David points out something important. He says, look, the sacrifice over at the temple, the official way to worship God, is not what counts as trusting God. Coming to church doesn't count as trusting God. It's not the key thing. Burnt offerings and sin offerings, or money put in the box, like I say every time that we're going around greeting one another, doesn't count as trusting God. What counts as trusting God is wanting to do God's will. What counts as trusting God is being willing to do God's will even when we're afraid or worried, or sometimes even when we're selfish and want to do something different. And here's a very important thing for the whole question of ethics, the question of what should I do, what am I supposed to do, what do I have to do. David says here, your law is within my heart. Jeremiah repeats that 200 years after David. God is going to write the law in our hearts. Jesus quotes that. What this means is that what we should do is not a matter of someone from outside of us telling us what to do. You got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do the other thing. Here's the preacher telling you to go to church, telling you to worship, telling you to give your money to tithe, telling you to work at Elijah's promise or stuff like that. That's not where it really comes from. It's already the case that God has changed your heart. It's already the case that Jesus Christ has become human and is our new heart. It's already the case that the Holy Spirit dwells within us. No one needs to tell us what to do. What we have to do is let what's truly in our hearts out. Is to let what's truly in our hearts out. Think about it. If you weren't afraid, if you were sure that everything would turn out all right in the end, if you weren't lonely, if you weren't desperate for affection, if you weren't needy and poor, if everything was good and you knew everything was going to turn all right, what would you want to do? How would you want to act? Wouldn't you, just as naturally as can be, want to do good things and good things for other people and help others and take care of others, wouldn't all the good things that the prophets talk about and Jesus talks about spring from your heart perfectly naturally? God has already written his law in our hearts. It's not something we have to do first, and then God will do something for us. It's something God has done first, and he's given permission to us to act like God's people. We're allowed to act like God's people. We don't have to act like people who ought to be God's people but aren't yet. We don't have to do that. The law is already written in our hearts. And if this is the case, then one of the things we do as a result of that is to tell other people about it, so that they too can become unafraid and able to let the good in their hearts come out. I mean, and here it is. David is saying, the righteousness is there. It's right in my heart. I got to not hide it. I got to share it with others. I got to not conceal it. I got to share it with others. It'll come out. Not, I got to do it, and then everything will come out. It's already there. I just have to show it to others. Now, this is a psalm that was written in memory of times of trouble, when it was hard to trust the Lord, when it was difficult to believe that everything would come out all right. And there are two sources of those difficulties, and these 3 verses are about one of those sources, and one of those sources is my iniquities, the things I have done wrong, the bad stuff I've done. The stuff that's not what's truly in my heart, it's the twisted stuff that's broken around my heart. God's already changed our hearts. But it's still there sometimes. And it's a problem sometimes. And it makes it hard for us to trust God when we say to ourselves, what terrible things I've done. What a lousy person I am. How unkind, how unloving I've been. God can't possibly be happy with me. God can't possibly be happy with me. We feel that way sometimes, we act that way sometimes, and it's a mistake. But it's a mistake we need to be rescued from. We need God to break through and say, no, that's not who you really are. No, that's not what counts with me. No, that's not the ultimate reality about you and me. The ultimate reality about you and me is Jesus Christ. That God and human beings are one together by God's grace, by God's kindness, by God's gift. So we need to be rescued from our own foolishness and sin, lest our hearts fail within us. So we pray to God to come and save us quickly. We really don't want to go on in this morass of despair and depression and self-doubt and self-accusation for very long, because it gets wearing. Believe me, I know. It gets wearing. I've done a lot of it in my life, and it's awful. Then there's the stuff from outside that we have to be saved from. We are sometimes attacked. There are sometimes people who want to shame us or put us into confusion or want to ruin us or disgrace us. It does happen that there are external ills, external damages that might come upon us. And we want God to rescue us from those too. And in part, trusting in God means remembering that in the long run, God is in control and will make all turn out well. And we remember that by going back and remembering the good things that God has already done. That's the process, that's the cure, that's the way we change our hearts to feel like they trust God, because we know from our history that God is already trustworthy. when we get to the end, you notice I've turned this one green instead of orange and blue. We'll recite this last verse all together. We are all poor and needy, at least in spirit, even if not in money. I mean, this is America after all. We all do need God, even if we don't need a small fortune. We all do need help. And we need to be delivered from our own foolishness, and we need to be delivered from the dangers of the world around us. And it does frequently feel like God is being a little bit slow. Like God is being a little bit slow. That's one of the reasons why we recite those long stories. I just said earlier that one of the wonderful things God did was He led the people through the desert where water was short and food was short. On the other hand, it took 40 years of traveling through the desert where water was short and food was short before they came to a land flowing with milk and honey. For us who live but 70 or 80 years, over against God's purposes for us, which last thousands and thousands of years, it does sometimes seem that God is slow. And God encourages us to pray to Him. Do not delay. So I hope you all read through what was up there as we did it, so that it will be your own when we recite it together. So let's go back to the beginning. Blue on this side, orange on this side, last verse all together.
There was one verse that looked yellow instead of orange. Was that something different, or is that
No,
just a variety of orange?
That was just
Okay.
a clumsy attempt to get orange out of the
Okay.
buttons you press with the mouse.
Okay.
Anything that looks yellow is really orange. I waited
patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry.
He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand.
He
Put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in Him.
Blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, who does not look to the crowd, to those who turn aside to false gods.
Many, Lord my God, are the wonders you have done, the things you planned for us. None can compare with you.
Were I to speak and tell of your deeds, they would be too many to declare.
Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but my ears you have opened. Burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not require.
Then I said, Here I am, I have come. It is written about me in the scroll.
I desire to do your will, my God. Your law is within my heart.
I proclaim your saving acts in the great assembly. I do not seal my lips, Lord, as you know.
I do not hide your righteousness in my heart. I speak of your faithfulness and your saving help. I do not conceal your love and your faithfulness from the great assembly.
Do not withhold your mercy from me, Lord. May your love and faithfulness always protect me.
For troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me, and I cannot see. They are more than the hairs of my head, and my heart fails within me.
Be pleased to save me, Lord. Come quickly, Lord, to help me.
May all who want to take my life be put to shame and confusion. May all who desire my ruin be turned back in disgrace.
May those who say to me, Aha, aha, be appalled at their own shame.
But may all who seek you rejoice and be glad in you. May those who long for your saving help always say, the Lord is great. But as for me, I am poor and needy. May the Lord think of me. You are my help and my deliverer. You are my God. Do not delay.
This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So I want to talk about trusting God. And based on this song, I have several things I want to say. And the first is, it doesn't matter how you feel about it. Sometimes you will be able to feel your trust in God. It will feel like everything's going to be all right. It will feel like everything will turn out good. Like your plans will work out. Like you'll find the right college. Like you'll find the right person to marry. Like your children will recover from their illnesses. It will feel like you are certain that good things will happen. But that feeling all by itself is not trusting God. That feeling is a product of trusting God. Sometimes you won't feel that way. Sometimes you'll wake up in the middle of the night and you'll think that it's all nonsense and that life is empty and we live and then we die and that's all there is. Sometimes you'll look at what's going on in the world and you'll say, this is all going to hell in a handbasket. Nothing's going to fix it. Things are going to get worse. People are going to become more polarized in politics. There's going to be no peace. Sometimes you'll look at your own life and you'll think, there's no way out. There's no way out. I'm totally trapped. I can't get away from this. I can't make a new way for myself. I can't find out what I have to do in order to gain a happy life. Sometimes it's going to feel like that. And it doesn't matter either way, because what trusting God means is how you act. It's how you act that constitutes trusting God, that constitutes putting your trust in God. It's whether or not you act in a way that takes a chance that God will do what God has said. For instance, the Bible talks in several places about tithing, about giving a tenth of what you get, not just to the church and the temple. Actually, the temple got a simple price. A lot of the tithing was aimed at the poor, the orphan, and the widow. Others were aimed at the Levites and the priests to support them so they could run the religious thing. But it talks about giving to God, a share of what you get. And Linda and I have tried to take that seriously, and most years, for the last 6 to 10 years, we've managed to give more than 10% of our money away. Some of it directly to people who are needy and without ever even getting tax credit for it. We have this financial advisor, a young kid. Well, he's not a young kid anymore, is he? He was a young kid when he started being our financial advisor. And he was flabbergasted because here we were giving away thousands of dollars and still managing to save more for retirement than other people who had incomes just as big as we did. He was, surprised, and he said, okay, I've got some other people who do it, and it happens for them too, but he was still surprised. You could tell from the way he talked and from his attitude. And Linda would tell him, hey, this is God's faithfulness. This is what it means to trust in God and to find out that God takes care of us. Now, sometimes Linda would talk as though God was injecting money into our savings account. And she's looking at me now. And I watched where the money...
We caught him at it. We did.
But most of the time, it was that God changed our hearts because we did trust Him. So that we didn't have, as I've seen in people's driveways, a powerboat, 2 extra cars, and 3 all-terrain vehicles and whatever. We didn't do that. We trusted that God was going to give us the things we needed to be happy and cheerful. A lot of people don't trust God, and so they trust wealth. I can buy happiness, or at least I can rent some happiness for a little while. And if you do that, you're not going to be able to save as much money for your retirement. Trusting God changes the way that you act. Sometimes we look at life and there are things we don't want to do that if everything was wonderful we would want to do, like taking care of needy people and friends. And sometimes it's hard to do. We have a friend who is sick, chronically sick, has been sick for more than 20 years. We spent yesterday helping empty out a storage unit she had so that she could stop paying money she couldn't afford for it. And I don't always trust God about this friend. I am afraid that her needs will get so severe that we'll have to let her come live with us. I am afraid of that. I don't like the idea. I'm not sure that God will do something else to take care of it. I'm afraid God will dump that duty on me. But I have a wife who listens to God better than I do. Yeah, she listens to God better than I do. I might talk about it better than she does, but she listens better than I do. So I do the things that trusting in God means. We've helped take care of her finances from time to time. We're helping her get arranged to be able to move and to be able to support herself in a room of her own by doing a mess of work, taking care of something she can't take care of anymore. She's too weak. She's too hard up. Trusting God means doing the law that's written on our hearts. It means taking a chance and doing something different than we would have done otherwise if we didn't trust God and we only trusted our own abilities, our own choices, our own wisdom, and our own selfishness. We do that a lot, you know, here in America. We trust our own selfishness. If I always take care of me, then I will always have enough to take care of me. And it isn't always true. Sometimes the housing market crashes and it crashes the rest of the economy too. Sometimes the stock market crashes, none of you remember that from 1929. And with it, it crashes all the debts that people took out in order to buy stocks. And a third of all the people in the whole country are out of work. Sometimes being selfish and taking care of yourself doesn't work. And you don't succeed at taking care of yourself. What God expects us to learn to do is to choose our actions based upon who we are in Jesus Christ. What do people who are like Jesus do? And if you know, then go and do it. The third thing that constitutes trusting God is telling people about it, is telling the story of how you trusted God, at least some of the time, and what happened when you did. And sometimes it's a story that's got a bad part before it gets to the good part. But then Walt Disney used to say, you can't have a happy evening unless there's a tear first. Sometimes our stories start with trouble we've gotten into. Sometimes our stories start with a lousy situation that dumped itself on us. But they proceed forward to what God did for us and how God enabled us to be different people, and how in addition to enabling us to be different people, God restored our fortunes and gave us a firm and safe path to walk on. And from time to time, made us comfortable and well off and happy. But trusting God means not just being glad that it happened that way. It means telling other people too. Because Other people aren't going to get to see the waters part and the Israelites escape from slavery. Other people aren't going to get to see the waters of the Jordan part and the Israelites enter the promised land. Other people aren't going to get to see the resurrection and Jesus walking around. What they get to see is that your life has been changed. And when you give your testimony or your witness, as they talk about, you aren't expected to tell these old stories. Those are reference stories, and you will tell them eventually. And people who turn to God and discover God and develop faith in God and trust in God will want to go, because these are the source of revelation. But what they need to hear first is how your life has been changed and what God did for you. So trusting God means, third of all, daring to tell your own story. Believing that people aren't going to laugh at you and think you're silly, or that you've deceived yourself, or that it's all a joke, but that they will accept your honesty. And even if they disbelieve that there's a God doing it, they'll at least believe your honesty. And that's all that God requires of you when you tell your story, is honesty. And the honesty includes some of the elements in the psalm. An admission of our own crud that we've done. An admission of the lousy places we've been and the troubles God had to rescue us from. And last of all, we need to remember that trusting in God means loving other people as God loved us, and taking care of the poor and the unfortunate, and doing what is right in the world, to stand up against evildoing and to take care of the people who are oppressed. That's what it means to be religious, not to go to church and to sing our praise songs and to put money in the offering basket. Now, I happen to think we ought to do those things, but we ought to do those things because those things are practice for doing good deeds and changing the world. Those things are reminders of what God has done for us and the stories we have to tell and the things we have to do now in a world that needs us to be light and salt. Those things are a preparation, but they're a preparation, not the thing itself. The thing itself is to do as Jesus did and to love other people as God has loved us. And that's what trusting God means, even if our feelings sometimes don't go along with it. So sometimes as an exercise, you ought to look at some of the Psalms. And after you've looked at them and maybe read some of the notes in the Bible, if you've got a Bible with notes, so you recognize some of the parts that maybe were different 3,000 years ago, then you need to say, okay, if I were writing this psalm, if this were a song I was writing, what would I say? What would I say? That's what trusting the Lord means. Amen.